I could also date the actual, real, substantive birth of Israeli democracy to 1953, which is embarrassing because that's the year I told my columnist that he could not use. More specifically, to October of 1953. That's when the Supreme Court delivered its ruling, written by Justice Shimon Agranat, in the Kol Ha'am case. Kol Ha'am, that literally means voice of the people. More idiomatically translated, it would mean the voice of the masses, was the Communist Party newspaper. The hottest political issue in Israel's early years was whether to align with the East Bloc or the Right Bloc. Ben-Gurion obviously tilted toward the West. The Communist Party obviously was not happy with this. They wrote a rather harsh editorial in their newspaper, and Ben-Gurion's interior minister exploited a British colonial law that allowed the government to shut a newspaper for 2 weeks as a punishment. So Kol Ha'am went to the Supreme Court. Agranat wrote the ruling. In an act of judicial activism in the best sense of the word, he said, you can't do that. Now, there was no constitution, no Bill of Rights, but what Agranat argued is as follows. The Israeli Declaration of Independence showed that the intention of the founders, we're talking 5 years before it, right, including Ben-Gurion, he says, you guys said you were going to create a democracy. Now, let's go back and look at the philosophical roots of democracy and freedom of the press. He went back to philosophical writings, and he showed that freedom of the press was basic to a democracy. He then acknowledged that as a new country, Israel had no precedent, established precedents in the realm of freedom of the press, so he allowed himself to import as a block the entirety of American legal precedent on freedom of the press. And he then said, you can't, in a democracy, you cannot shut a newspaper because you don't like what they said. This is clearly the greatest contribution an American immigrant has ever made to the state of Israel. Agranat was American-born and educated, and it established that democracy would not just be majority rule, but include protection of the rights of the minority. That side of the picture has continued. Government changes in Israel by, by vote. There's a level of voter participation that has never been achieved in American elections, or certainly not within our lifetimes. There's judicial restraint of the executive and the legislative branches. There's an intense civil society. And there are also today very serious challenges to Israel as a state, internal challenges to Israel as a state and as a democracy, which are the result of policies adopted for short-term goals, decisions with unexpected results, and sometimes failure to make decisions. One of those challenges is posed both to the state and to Judaism by the relationship of state and synagogue in the Jewish state. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. One, just as a story, there is a building, or a set of buildings in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Romema. Romema is an ultra-Orthodox, Haredi neighborhood. You see, as you come through the neighborhood, 4, 5, or 6 apartment buildings, very nice apartment buildings. The people who live there are ultra-Orthodox Jews with jobs, either in the rabbinic system of Israel or they grew up abroad, so they actually got a profession. Nice apartments. And underneath the buildings is a 3-floor parking garage. And in the parking garage are little storerooms. This is standard in Israeli apartment buildings. You get the apartment upstairs, and then down below, you get a little storeroom where you store your sukkah and your boxes and your baby carriage if you're not using it and so forth. Right? It serves the function of a private garage. And except when I went through the parking garage of this building, I found in many of the storerooms that there were names on the door and doorbells and water meters. I paced off one of the storerooms that was 8 paces by 8 paces, and I don't have big paces. These little storerooms were being rented out to young ultra-Orthodox families who could not afford to live anywhere else. The little high window looked out into the dark, exhaust-filled parking garage. That is a sign of incredible poverty, and it is a result of the one real law that is always followed in the state of Israel, which is the law of unintended consequences. And if your tour guide, as he takes you through or she takes you through Mea Shearim or some other ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, points to ultra-Orthodox society and says, this is the way our great-grandparents lived in Eastern Europe, it's not true. Like every other movement in the modern world which claims to be old-time religion, this is a creation of modernity. I could give you more examples later, but that would be a different lecture. But this is a creation of a reality in the state of Israel, and I'll explain to you how it happened. In 1949, the first year of the Knesset passed a law granting free and compulsory education, at that point through 8th grade. That was a big deal still. Until then, among the Zionist majority of Jews in Palestine and then in the state of Israel, there had been 3 Zionist school systems. There was a religious Zionist school system, there was a socialist Zionist school system, and there was a capitalist Zionist school system. And you had to decide when your kids started first grade which political track you were going to put your kids in. There's a wonderful description of this in Amos Oz's memoir, A Tale of Love and Darkness. But in any case, they were supported by the community and by parental tuition. And there were a few scattered ultra-Orthodox schools with very little money. So the state wanted to obligate everybody to send their kids to school, and it was not yet powerful enough to break up the political school systems. So it just funded them, and it created a set of Arab schools for the Arab population, which obviously had been going to these schools, and it created a 4th Jewish stream, which was the ultra-Orthodox stream. What that did is that a 19 or 20-year-old young woman could finish high school in a year or 2 of teacher seminary and get a job which was then well paid as an elementary school teacher. And what the leaders of the ultra-Orthodox community, which had been decimated by both people not becoming unreligious and by the Holocaust, said, this is a chance to revive our community. These young women will work as teachers, and they can support their husbands, and for the first time, the men can stay in yeshiva instead of having to go to work when they get married. And that was the beginning of what's called, by Israeli sociologist Menachem Friedman, Chevrat HaLomdim, the Society of Scholars, the idea that men would stay in yeshiva and keep learning after marriage age, meanwhile, dropping drastically, number of kids rising rapidly. This is an unsustainable model economically. It's a situation which persists to this day. It creates a situation where the state funds schools where, again, to quote Friedman, there is no preparation for the economy of this world, but there is preparation for the economy of the next world. And there is no training in what to me is even more important than the economic issue, there is no training in literature, history, civics, the training of the mind necessary for somebody to be a free participant in a democratic society. All this paid for by the alleged unbelievers, the unbelievers ranging from secular to modern Orthodox. I'm as much of an unbeliever for that community as the most secular kibbutznik. It's also funded a situation where the community can continue to segregate itself more and more from the outside society. And inside of that segregated society, there can be a competition for innovative stringency in the observance of halakha, of Jewish law, all in the name of conservatism. I want to point out the irony of this. The law keeps being interpreted in a more and more radically stringent way inside of a community that says that there should be no change. So, for example, in the last 20 years, a view has taken hold among many rabbis of the ultra-Orthodox community that conversion is conditional. Flies in the face of all of Jewish religious tradition. Jewish religious tradition, if you convert to Judaism, from then on, you're Jewish. It's like you were born Jewish, ain't nothing more you can do about it. You sign the contract, it's for life. And to the end of all generations, for that matter. But the new view that took off in the 80s says that you have to be sincere in accepting Judaism when you convert. And your sincerity can be measured by whether you're keeping halakha 5 or 10 or 20 years later. So if we judge that this person is not strictly following halakha now, it means that their conversion was not sincere then, and they never really became Jewish. Okay, this, as I said, is a radical innovation. It probably wouldn't, they can interpret Jewish law however they want, except it combines with the second factor that the state maintains a rabbinic bureaucracy which is responsible for marriage, divorce, and conversion in the state of Israel, which means that in violation of the civil rights of other citizens, they can impose that definition on other citizens. This is a problem for democracy, in the deep sense of democracy in terms of human rights. A second set of unintended consequences, more portentous, if anything, came after Israel's necessary victory in the unplanned war of 1967. I stress the 1967 was unplanned, it was unexpected, I think by both sides. Avi Shlaim, the historian who has has no respect for the official narratives of either the Israelis or the Arabs, says that the 1967 war was the only Israeli-Arab war that neither side planned on or wanted. Again, you can go through the history to find out why a war took place anyway, but one of the consequences of that was that unexpectedly, by winning, Israel conquered the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, and had to come up with policy ex post facto. Von Clausewitz, the great historian, Karl von Clausewitz, the great theorist, modern theorist of war, said that war is policy by other means. In this case, the war had already taken place and the policy had to be designed afterwards. Did we conquer that land to trade it for peace, or did we conquer that land to keep it because it was really ours to begin with? The risks of holding the territory were clear within Israeli political discussion from the start. So for instance, on June 19th, 1967, the first cabinet meeting, a week after the war, on the future of the occupied territory, what should policy be on these territories? Moshe Dayan proposed that the West Bank be kept under permanent Israeli control. The Arabs would not be given citizenship, but they would have some sort of form of local home rule or autonomy. The Justice Minister, Yaakov Shimshon Shapiro, who was a member of the largest party in Israel, the Prime Minister's Party, Mapai, responded that holding the West Bank with its Arab population and not giving the Arabs the vote was impossible, quote, in a time of decolonialization, unquote. In other words, that would turn the West Bank into a colony. It says colonialism is out, folks. We're against colonialism. As a matter of fact, I found in Levi Eshkol's office files his letter of support to the president of Zambia for the struggle against white rule in Rhodesia. He says, we're against colonialism. You can't do that. He said, on the other hand, if we keep the land and we give the Arab residents the vote, quote, we're done with the Zionist enterprise, unquote, because then you'll have a binational state. I stress that this criticism and other parallel criticisms, which I found in top secret Israeli documents from the summer of 1967, these are from top Israeli officials up to the cabinet level, not from campus radicals in Berkeley or in Paris. No decision was taken. In fact, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol told Lyndon Johnson at their summit in January of 1968, my government has decided not to decide on, it's like Eshkol to a T. Eshkol is the man who said of himself, when I'm asked to order in the restaurant coffee or tea, I say half and half. He's also, by the way, the only Israeli prime minister regarding whom a book exists that begins with the title, The Wit and Wisdom of. Nobody else would even get close to being able to have such a book. But in any case, they didn't make up their mind. That left room, a policy vacuum leaves room for things to happen without a policy decision, particularly by those who know what they want, and particularly following unthought out ideas from the past. And what happened was the people who knew what they wanted were very often applying the ways of thinking that they had used before Israel became independent. Again, to thank Tal for his definitions, they weren't thinking in sovereign terms. They were still thinking like a movement rather than like a state. So, in October of 1967, Yigal Allon, I mentioned him before as a general, he was now the Minister of Labor, sent a memo. I found this in his office files, in his private archive, sent a memo to the head of the survey department in the Labor Ministry, which had a near monopoly on maps in the state of Israel. And the memo said, from here on in, don't print the pre-war boundaries on the maps. The only thing that will be printed is the ceasefire lines after the war in '67. Now, those pre-war boundaries still were, except in the case of annexed East Jerusalem, still were and are, for Israeli purposes, the definition of the edge of Israeli sovereignty. But the borders of the state no longer appeared on the map.